My husband mocked my career struggles, telling everyone I was lazy, even though I worked 2 jobs. But when he secretly drained our joint savings to fund his mistress's lifestyle, I stayed quiet, until the bank exposed his fraud, and suddenly he was the one seen as a dependent. The laughter around the table wasn't mine, but it was at my expense. "She's lazy," my husband declared, his voice carrying across the room with a confidence that made everyone lean in. "2 jobs and she still acts like she's exhausted. I swear she'd rather nap than work." Glasses clinked, heads nodded, and the room filled with chuckles. I sat frozen, fork suspended halfway to my plate, my cheeks burning as though I had been branded. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but the words refused to leave my mouth. That wasn't the first time he had turned my struggles into entertainment. He had perfected the art of disguising cruelty as concern. At family dinners he leaned back in his chair, smirk tugging at his lips, and said, "She thinks she's busy but really she just likes to complain." His brothers laughed, his mother shook her head, and I forced a smile, pretending it didn't sting. Inside though, I was unraveling. Behind closed doors the exhaustion was real. I worked 2 jobs. One at a small office during the day, another at a diner in the evenings. My feet ached, my back throbbed, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. Yet when I dragged myself home, he dismissed my efforts as insignificant. "You make it sound like you're the only one who works," he scoffed, lounging on the couch. My body carried the weight of endless shifts, but the deeper pain was knowing he never acknowledged my sacrifices. Family gatherings became stages for his sarcasm. He painted me as incompetent, weaving stories that made me look foolish. "She can't even keep track of her schedule," he'd say, chuckling as relatives leaned in to hear more. I sat quietly, wondering if anyone saw the truth behind his performance. Did they notice the way my shoulders slumped, the way my smile didn't reach my eyes? Or were they too entertained to care? His constant ridicule seeped into my thoughts, poisoning my confidence. At night I lay awake replaying his words. Lazy. Hopeless. Always complaining. They echoed until I began to wonder if he was right. Maybe I was failing. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Even though I knew I was keeping our household afloat, doubt gnawed at me. Small incidents added weight to the silence I carried. One morning I spilled coffee on the counter and he laughed, saying, "Classic you." Another afternoon I forgot to buy milk and he announced to his brothers on the phone, "She can't even handle a grocery list." Each moment chipped away at me, but instead of breaking me, they planted seeds of quiet anger. I didn't fight back then. I stored every word, every smirk, every dismissive glance. My silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. I learned to mask my resentment, to tuck it away where he couldn't see. But inside I was waiting. Waiting for the day when silence would no longer be my shield, when the weight of his mockery would shift, and he would finally feel the sting he had forced me to endure. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I returned home to find him entertaining friends. He gestured toward me as I walked in, apron still stained from the diner. "See? Always tired. She thinks working 2 jobs makes her a hero." Laughter erupted and I stood there, frozen in the doorway. My chest tightened, but I forced a smile, retreating to the kitchen. I washed dishes with trembling hands, each clink of the plates echoing the humiliation I had swallowed. Later that night I sat alone in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the streetlights outside. My mind replayed the evening, the laughter, the smirk on his face. I whispered to myself, "One day this will end." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a promise. The mask of mockery he wore fooled many. To outsiders he was charming, witty, the life of the party. To me he was cruel, dismissive, relentless. And though I remained silent, my silence was not surrender. It was the quiet gathering of strength, the slow build of resolve, the hidden fire waiting to ignite. I whispered to myself that one day this would end, and soon the cracks began to show. It started quietly, with numbers that didn't add up. One evening I sat at the kitchen table, bills spread out in front of me, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. My pen circled amounts that looked wrong. At first I thought I was tired, maybe misreading the statements. But the more I checked, the clearer it became. Money was disappearing. Not in one large sum, but in steady drips that left me unsettled. I leaned closer to the paper, tracing each line with my finger. Grocery charges, utility payments, the usual expenses were there. But mixed in were transactions that didn't belong, Hotel stays, boutique purchases, dinners at restaurants far beyond our usual budget. My chest tightened. I had worked 2 jobs, skipped meals, walked instead of taking the bus, all to save. And here it was, vanishing into places I had never been. The discovery was like peeling back wallpaper and finding rot underneath. I opened my laptop, scrolling through transaction histories late into the night. Each click revealed more. Luxury spas, weekend getaways, jewelry stores. My stomach churned as the trail unfolded. He wasn't careless, he was deliberate. He was living another life entirely. The realization hit hardest when I saw the name of a spa. I remembered asking him once if we could go together just once to escape the grind. He laughed, said it was a waste of money, told me to be practical. Yet here it was, paid for in full, not for me but for someone else. My hands trembled as I scrolled further, each transaction painting a picture of indulgence. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I carried the knowledge quietly like a stone lodged in my chest. He strutted around the house, boasting about being the provider, reminding me how lucky I was to have him. "You'd be lost without me," he said one evening, smirking as he flipped through a magazine. I bit my tongue, tasting the bitterness of silence, knowing the truth he didn't realize I held. The weight of silence grew heavier with each passing day. At dinner, he bragged to friends about his financial control, claiming he managed everything while I just worked small jobs. They nodded, impressed, while I sat there forcing a smile. Inside I was screaming. I wanted to shout that he was draining us, that his arrogance was built on lies, but I stayed quiet. My silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Small incidents of arrogance became unbearable. One morning he tossed a receipt onto the counter, smirking. "See? I handle the big expenses. You just worry about your little paychecks." I picked up the slip, recognizing it as another charge tied to her. My chest tightened, but I said nothing. Another time he mocked me in front of his brothers, claiming I depended on him for everything. They laughed and I sat there, my nails digging into my palms, knowing he was draining us to impress someone else. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was emotional. I remembered nights when I skipped meals to save money, mornings when I walked to work instead of taking the bus, all so we could build a future together. And yet that future was being siphoned away, piece by piece, to fund someone else's comfort. I began noticing patterns. He'd leave the house with excuses, late meeting, catching up with a friend, and return smelling faintly of cologne I didn't recognize. His phone buzzed with messages he quickly dismissed, turning the screen away from me. I watched, silent, each detail adding to the puzzle I was piecing together. One evening I tested him. I asked casually about a charge I had seen, pretending I was confused. His face tightened for a moment before he laughed it off. "You worry too much," he said, patting my hand as if I were a child. But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the brief panic he couldn't hide. I started keeping my own log, a quiet tracker of every transaction, every unexplained absence, every lie. It became my secret weapon, a record of the double life he thought was invisible. Each entry was a reminder that I wasn't losing my mind, I was uncovering the truth. The silence gave me power. While he flaunted his supposed control, I held the evidence of his betrayal. He thought he was untouchable, mocking me for depending on him, but I knew the reality. He was draining us not to build a future but to impress someone else. There were moments when the anger nearly consumed me. I wanted to scream, to throw the receipts in his face, to demand answers. But I restrained myself, channeling the fury into patience. I knew that exposing him too soon would only give him time to cover his tracks. I wanted the truth to surface on its own, undeniable and complete. In the meantime, I endured his arrogance. He strutted through life, convinced of his superiority, while I watched quietly, waiting. Each insult, each boast, each dismissive glance added fuel to the fire I kept hidden. The betrayal was a wound, but it was also a revelation. It showed me the depth of his deceit, the hollowness of his pride, and the strength of my silence. I wasn't powerless. I was waiting. And as I waited, I began to see him differently. Not as the provider he claimed to be, but as a man building his empire on lies. His arrogance was a mask, and I held the key to tearing it away. The silence I carried had become my strength, and it was that silence that framed the moment everything collapsed. The bank's letter was only the beginning. Soon the calls came, and then the meetings. His name was dragged into conversations he couldn't control, and the truth was laid bare. The fraudulent withdrawals were undeniable. The numbers told a story he could no longer twist into jokes or excuses. I watched him shrink in real time. Friends who once laughed at his clever remarks now avoided his gaze. Neighbors who used to greet him warmly crossed the street instead. At work, colleagues whispered in corners, their voices low but sharp. The man who had built his identity on being the provider was suddenly seen as a dependent, stripped of the pride he had worn like armor. One evening we attended a small gathering. Someone asked casually, "Is it true about the bank?" His fork clattered against the plate, his face flushed. He stammered, tried to deflect, but the room was heavy with judgment. I sat beside him, calm, composed, my hands folded neatly in my lap. For the first time I didn't feel small. I felt steady, grounded, powerful in my silence. His humiliation deepened when the mistress's name surfaced. The bank traced certain expenses directly to her, and whispers spread quickly. He drained their savings for her, people murmured. The same friends who once laughed at his jokes now shook their heads in disbelief. He tasted the sting of shame, and it was bitter. At home he lashed out, not with insults meant to wound me, but with frantic attempts to salvage his image. "You have to stand by me," he pleaded one night, pacing the kitchen. "People will think I'm nothing without you." His voice cracked, desperation spilling into the air. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the fear in his eyes. The man who once mocked me for depending on him was now begging me to hold him up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw accusations. I simply stood taller, carrying myself with dignity. "I don't need to defend you," I said quietly. "You built this yourself." His shoulders slumped, and for the first time he had no retort. Rebuilding my life began in small steps. I opened a separate account, one he couldn't touch. I reached out to old friends, the ones whose messages he had dismissed or hidden. Slowly, I stitched together a circle of support, people who saw me for who I was, not for the caricature he had painted. Each day felt lighter. I walked to work with a new rhythm in my step, no longer weighed down by his ridicule. At the diner, I laughed with coworkers, rediscovering joy in simple moments. At the office, I took on projects with confidence, no longer second-guessing myself. There were setbacks, of course. Some nights, the memories of his mockery returned, echoing in my mind. But instead of breaking me, they reminded me of how far I had come. I wasn't the woman sitting silently at the dinner table anymore. I was the woman who had endured, who had uncovered the truth, who had walked away with her head held high. The lesson was clear. His downfall wasn't my revenge, it was the natural consequence of his cruelty. My true victory was reclaiming my voice, my peace, and my freedom. One afternoon I passed him on the street. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders hunched, eyes darting away from mine. He didn't speak, and I didn't stop. I kept walking, the sun warm on my face, the air crisp with possibility. That moment was closure, not in words but in the quiet strength of moving forward. I built a new chapter surrounded by respect and honesty. I learned to trust myself again, to value my own worth. The scars remained, but they were reminders of resilience, not weakness. And as I stood in my own space, free from his shadow, I realized something profound. Silence had once been my shield, but now it was my strength. I didn't need to shout to prove my worth. I had lived it, endured it, and emerged stronger. My freedom wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, quiet, and unshakable. And it was mine.